Welcome to Copilot Podcasts. Here's something that should stop you cold. The U.S. small arms ammunition market is worth over $7.7 billion and growing, and yet one of the most critical ingredients in the propellant that makes all of it work is predominantly sourced from China. That's not a trade statistic. That's a national security vulnerability sitting inside a booming industry. Today, we're getting into what decentralizing small arms manufacturing down to the zip code level could actually mean for US defense readiness. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why the current supply chain is structurally fragile despite its size, what the case for distributed micromanufacturing really looks like, and what role AI and additive manufacturing play in making any of this possible. I've got someone here who has been deep in this topic, and I want to start with a question that I think most people would find genuinely surprising. Just how concentrated is US small arms production right now?
So the concentration is pretty striking when you actually look at the numbers. According to the Fair Market Value Industry Report on NICE 332992, that's the official classification for small arms ammunition manufacturing, there are only 212 establishments in the entire country as of the 2025 annual average. 212 for an industry that feeds military procurement, law enforcement, and a massive civilian market.
Wait, 212 for the whole country?
For the whole country. And that number has only grown 6.6% in establishment count over the 5-year period from 2017 to 2022. So we're not talking about a rapidly expanding base of producers. We're talking about a relatively small, geographically concentrated set of facilities carrying enormous strategic weight.
And when you say concentrated, who are the big players actually running this?
So the industry analysis from Ronan's Grips, published in July 2025, breaks it down into tiers. Tier 1 is your defense and commercial giants, Olin Winchester, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and critically, they manage the Lake City Army Ammunition Plant, which is a government-owned, contractor-operated facility, a GO-CO in the jargon, that serves as the backbone of U.S. military small-caliber ammunition production.
So the military's primary ammunition supply runs through essentially one major plant.
That's the core of it, yes. Then you have Tier 2, companies like Hornady and Sig Sauer, who are winning high-value military contracts for more specialized systems. And Tier 3 is your component specialists, your niche contractors. But the point is, the whole structure is top-heavy and centralized. And that same Ronan's Grips analysis describes the industry as being in a state of, quote, profound transition characterized by a paradox of robust growth and critical vulnerability.
That phrase, robust growth and critical vulnerability, that's a tension worth sitting with. Because on the surface, a $7.7 billion market sounds like strength.
Right, and that's exactly the trap. The growth is real. Projections show the U.S. market expanding significantly through 2030, driven by geopolitical tensions, rising global defense spending, and a strong civilian market. But the growth is built on a foundation with some serious cracks in it.
So what are those cracks specifically?
The biggest one is raw material dependency. The Ronan's Grips analysis flags nitrocellulose, a key propellant ingredient, as being predominantly produced by China. That's not a minor input. Propellant is what makes ammunition function. If that supply gets disrupted, the entire production chain seizes up regardless of how many domestic facilities you have.
And this isn't a hypothetical risk. The Defense Security Monitor published a piece in June 2026 specifically about what they called the energetics bottleneck, the broader category of explosives, propellants, and pyrotechnics. What did that find?
That piece by Juan Lopez is really sobering. It references a 2023 cross-agency study led by the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering involving the military services, the Missile Defense Agency, NIST, and NASA that produced something called the National Energetics Plan. And the conclusion was stark: a deteriorating domestic munitions industrial base, chronic underfunding, limited integration between government and commercial producers, increasing reliance on foreign precursor materials, and a constrained workforce pipeline.
So the government's own internal assessment is essentially saying, we have a structural problem here.
Exactly. And the Defense Security Monitor piece notes that conflicts like Ukraine have accelerated munitions consumption and placed additional strain on an already fragile supply chain. So the stress test is happening in real time, not in some future scenario.
Before we get into what a decentralized alternative might look like, I want to flag something that I think is genuinely underreported, the ownership question. Because it's not just about where things are made, it's about who owns the companies making them.
Yeah, this is a big one. The Ronins-Grips analysis covers the acquisition of what they call the Kinetic Group, which includes Federal, Remington, CCI, and Speer, all iconic American ammunition brands, by the Czechoslovak Group, or CSG, a $2 billion transaction. And the result is that a substantial portion of U.S. commercial ammunition supply is now under foreign control.
Federal, Remington, CCI, Speer, those are names that feel deeply American, and they're now owned by a Czech company.
Which introduces what the analysis calls new geopolitical variables into the domestic market. It's not necessarily a crisis on its own, but when you layer it on top of the foreign raw material dependency and the concentrated production base, you start to see why the conversation about decentralization is gaining traction.
So let's pivot to that conversation. What does the geographic picture of US firearms manufacturing actually look like? Because I think people assume it's spread out across the country.
There's actually a really useful dashlet on this. Researchers at Drew University, Lisa Jordan and her colleagues, published a geographical datelet of firearms manufacturing in the U.S. covering 2000 to 2020, using ATF's annual firearms manufacturing and export reports. They found 8,707 unique manufacturing licensees, with a total of nearly 134 million firearms released into commerce over that period.
That's a lot of licensees. So production is actually more distributed than I thought?
Well, here's the nuance. The DATESUP includes latitude and longitude for manufacturing locations that produced more than 1% of firearms released into commerce. And that's only 100 locations out of nearly 9,000 licensees. So the licensee base is broad, but the actual production volume is extremely concentrated in a small number of facilities.
So you have a long tail of small producers and a very short head of dominant ones.
Exactly. And that concentration is precisely what makes the system brittle. If you disrupt one of those 100 high-volume locations through a supply chain failure, a geopolitical event, or even a natural disaster, the impact is disproportionate.
Which brings us to the actual idea at the center of this episode. What would it mean to push manufacturing down to the zip code level? Like, is that even technically feasible?
So this is where the technology conversation gets really interesting. There's a white paper submitted to the Office of Science and Technology Policy by Nathan Diller, the CEO of Divergent Industries, that makes the case for AI-driven additive manufacturing as the enabling technology for exactly this kind of decentralized production. The argument is that AI-integrated additive manufacturing systems, what they call AIAM, can support on-demand, decentralized production of critical components.
So we're talking about 3D printing, essentially, but supercharged with AI.
In broad strokes, yes. The white paper argues that by leveraging AI for design optimization, predictive maintenance, and production scalability, the U.S. can reduce reliance on global supply chains and sustain a competitive advantage. And the framing is explicitly national security. This isn't just a manufacturing efficiency argument, it's a defense readiness argument.
And the DoD has its own framework for thinking about this, right? The Defense Logistics Agency published something in April 2025 that I thought was really telling.
Yeah, the DLA piece by Lagan Martin is fascinating because it shows the institutional thinking catching up to the strategic reality. They reference the Army's concept of sensor to shooter to sustainer, which is the operational loop for keeping warfighters supplied in contested environments. And the DLA is now arguing for adding a fourth link, supplier. So the full framework becomes sensor to shooter to sustainer to supplier.
That's a significant addition because it means the supplier isn't just a background function, it's part of the kill chain itself.
That's exactly the implication. And the DLA piece quotes Fleet Admiral E.J. King from World War II. You cannot be lethal without logistics. The point is that logistics, and by extension manufacturing, is a warfighting function. If your supplier is a single plant in Missouri or a foreign-controlled company, that's a tactical vulnerability.
And the Atlantic Council has been making a similar argument from the strategy side, right? Not just about logistics, but about the whole acquisition model.
Robert Murray, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, published an analysis in the Air Power Journal arguing that conventional military strategies built on large centralized acquisition programs are, and this is a direct quote, increasingly misaligned with the exigencies of modern warfare. He uses the Ukraine conflict as a case study for why decentralization and dispersal are the emergent trends reshaping the defense sector.
And Ukraine is such a vivid example because you've seen improvised, distributed production become a real factor in that conflict.
Exactly. Murray's argument is that the future of military operations lies in a more heterogeneous ecosystem, state and non-state actors, commercially available technologies, rethinking traditional financing models. And he's pretty blunt, ignoring these transformations risks not just tactical failures, but strategic obsolescence.
Strategic obsolescence. That's a phrase that should make defense planners uncomfortable.
It should, and it connects directly to the DoD's own policy on diminishing manufacturing sources. There's a DoD instruction, 424515, specifically about managing what they call DMSMs, diminishing manufacturing sources and material shortages. It establishes risk-based, proactive management for all DoD materiel throughout its lifecycle. The fact that this policy exists and was updated as recently as September 2025 tells you the problem is real and ongoing.
So the DoD is essentially acknowledging through its own policy framework that supplier bases shrink and materials become scarce, and they need a plan for that.
Right. And the question is whether the plan is reactive, managing shortages as they happen, or proactive, which is where the decentralization argument comes in. If you distribute production across more nodes, you reduce the blast radius of any single disruption.
Let me push back on this a little, though, because there's a real tension here. Small arms ammunition manufacturing is not simple. The Fair Market Value Report describes the production process, brass drawing, annealing, primer insertion with oriometric verification, propellant dispensing with gravimetric metering, quality control testing for chamber pressure and muzzle velocity. That's not something you can just spin up in a garage.
That's a completely fair pushback. And it's one of the core challenges of the micromanufacturing argument. The precision requirements are real. Modern automated lines achieve throughputs exceeding 20 million cartridges per year on a single shift. That's the scale and precision you're competing with. Distributed production has to meet those quality standards or it's not actually useful.
So is the AI additive manufacturing argument actually credible for something this precise?
The Divergent Industries white paper argues yes, specifically because AI enables design optimization and predictive maintenance that can maintain quality at smaller scales. But I think it's honest to say this is still more of a roadmap than a proven reality for small arms specifically. The white paper is making a case to OSTP for investment, not reporting on a deployed system.
Which is an important distinction. This is a direction of travel, not a destination that's been reached.
Exactly. And the budget signals are interesting here. The FY 2026 defense budget, as reported by Defense and Munitions in February 2026, requests $1.01 trillion, a 13% increase from 2025. Of that, $6.5 billion goes to conventional and hypersonic munitions. That's a significant investment signal, but it's still oriented toward large-scale procurement, not distributed micromanufacturing.
So the money is flowing into the existing model, even as the strategic arguments for changing that model are getting louder.
That's the institutional inertia problem. Large acquisition programs have constituencies, contractors, congressional districts, established supply chains. Shifting toward distributed production means disrupting all of that. And that's politically and bureaucratically hard, even when the strategic case is clear.
And there's a regulatory dimension too, right? You can't just set up a small arms manufacturing node anywhere. The ATF licensing requirements alone are significant.
Absolutely. The NSSF, the Firearm Industry Trade Association, tracks production data through ATF's annual firearms manufacturing and export reports. The licensing and compliance infrastructure is substantial. Any serious decentralization effort would have to work within or reform that regulatory framework, which adds another layer of complexity.
And yet the counter-argument is that the current regulatory and production concentration is itself a risk. Like, you've traded resilience for efficiency.
That's the core trade-off, and it's not unique to small arms. It's the same tension that showed up in pharmaceutical supply chains during COVID, in semiconductor supply chains with Taiwan, in rare earth minerals with China. Efficiency and resilience pull in opposite directions, and the U.S. has historically optimized for efficiency.
And the National Energetics Plan is essentially saying, we optimized wrong, and now we're paying for it.
That's a fair reading of it. The plan found chronic underfunding, limited integration between government and commercial producers, and a constrained workforce pipeline. Those aren't problems that appeared overnight. They're the result of decades of decisions that prioritized cost efficiency over strategic redundancy.
So when you think about what zip code level micromanufacturing would actually require to work, not just technologically, but systemically, what are the real prerequisites?
A few things have to come together. First, the technology has to mature. AI-driven additive manufacturing needs to demonstrate it can meet the precision and throughput standards for small arms components. Second, the regulatory framework has to adapt to allow distributed production without creating new security or quality risks. Third, the workforce pipeline has to be built. The National Energetics Plan specifically flagged this as a constraint. And fourth, the procurement model has to shift to actually incentivize distributed suppliers rather than defaulting to the large incumbents.
That's a lot of moving parts. And they all have to move roughly together.
Which is why the DLA's push for digitally interoperable supply chains is so important. Their April 2025 piece explicitly calls for supply chains that are, quote, as agile and responsive as kill chains. That's the vision. A supply network that can adapt in real time, not one that requires months of lead time to respond to a disruption.
Agile and responsive as kill chains. That's a striking standard to hold a supply chain to.
It is. And it implies a level of digital integration, AI, machine learning, real-time data flows that the current system doesn't have. The DLA piece talks about automated data flows for consumption and replenishment actions. That's the infrastructure that would make distributed manufacturing actually functional rather than just theoretically appealing.
I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, the Czechoslovak Group acquisition, because I think that's a thread that deserves more attention. If you're arguing for decentralization as a national security strategy, and simultaneously a foreign company is consolidating control over major American ammunition brands, those two trends are moving in opposite directions.
That tension is real. The Ronan's Grips analysis describes it as placing a substantial portion of U.S. commercial ammunition supply under foreign control and introducing new geopolitical variables. Now, the Czechoslovak Group is a NATO allied country's company, so this isn't the same as a Chinese acquisition. But it does illustrate how market forces can work against strategic resilience goals.
Right. The market doesn't optimize for national security, it optimizes for returns.
Exactly. And that's why the argument for government-backed distributed manufacturing infrastructure has to be made on strategic grounds, not economic ones. The Divergent Industries white paper makes this case explicitly. It's addressed to OSTP and frames AI-driven additive manufacturing as a national security investment, not a commercial opportunity.
Which is a different kind of argument than we usually hear about manufacturing policy.
It is. And it connects to a broader shift in how defense thinkers are framing the industrial base question. Robert Murray's Atlantic Council analysis talks about the need for a more heterogeneous ecosystem, state and non-state actors, commercially available technologies. That's a very different model than the GOCO plant model that currently dominates.
GOCO, government-owned, contractor-operated, like Lake City.
Right. Lake City is the canonical example. It's the backbone of military small-caliber production, and it's a single facility. The heterogeneous ecosystem argument says, what if instead of one Lake City, you had a network of smaller, distributed nodes that collectively match or exceed that capacity, but with no single point of failure?
And that's the zip code level vision. Not replacing Lake City, but building a resilient layer around it.
That's probably the most realistic framing. You're not going to dismantle the existing infrastructure. It's too embedded and too productive. But you can build a distributed supplementary layer that provides redundancy, surge capacity, and reduced dependency on any single geography or supplier.
And the workforce piece is interesting too, because distributed manufacturing isn't just a supply chain story, it's potentially an economic development story for communities that have lost manufacturing jobs.
That's a real dimension of it. The Divergent Industries white paper frames AI-driven manufacturing as a way to fortify the manufacturing sector broadly, not just for defense. And the National Energetics Plan's finding about a constrained workforce pipeline suggests there's a skills gap that would need to be addressed through training and education investment, which has its own community-level implications.
So the argument for decentralization has multiple layers: strategic resilience, reduced foreign dependency, economic development, workforce investment. It's not a single-issue case.
Which is also why it's complicated to execute. When you have multiple stakeholders with different interests, DoD, Congress, industry, communities, aligning them around a coherent distributed manufacturing strategy is genuinely hard. The institutional inertia we talked about earlier is partly a coordination problem.
And the urgency question matters here, because the National Energetics Plan findings, the DLA's contested logistics framing, the Ukraine conflict as a stress test, all of that suggests the window for getting this right isn't indefinite.
The Defense Security Monitor piece from June 2026 makes that urgency explicit. The energetics bottleneck isn't a future risk, it's a current constraint. High-intensity conflicts are consuming munitions faster than the industrial base can replenish them. That's not a theoretical scenario, that's what's happening right now.
So when you step back from all of this, the concentrated production base, the The foreign material dependencies, the ownership shifts, the emerging technology case for distributed manufacturing. What does this really come down to?
It comes down to a fundamental question about how you build resilience into a system that has been optimized for efficiency for decades. The U.S. small arms supply chain is productive and growing, $7.7 billion, expanding through 2030, but it is also brittle in ways that the industry's own analysts and the DoD's own assessments acknowledge. The case for zip code level micromanufacturing is essentially a case for trading some efficiency for a lot more resilience.
And the technology, AI-driven additive manufacturing, is what makes that trade-off potentially viable. Because historically, distributed production meant accepting lower quality and lower throughput. If AI/AM can close that gap, the trade-off looks very different.
That's the bet. And it's a bet that the Divergent Industries white paper is explicitly asking the government to make. The argument is that no single AI investment will have greater impact on national security than investment in AI-supported American manufacturing. Whether policymakers accept that framing is the open question.
And the DLA's 4S framework, sensor to shooter to sustainer to supplier, is the institutional signal that at least some parts of the defense establishment are starting to think about the supplier link as a warfighting function, not just a procurement function.
Right. And that framing matters because it changes the urgency calculus. If the supplier is part of the kill chain, then a fragile supplier base isn't just an economic problem, it's a readiness problem. And readiness problems get attention in ways that supply chain efficiency problems don't.
Here's what I keep coming back to, though. The Atlantic Council's Robert Murray says large centralized acquisition programs deliver yesterday's technology at next week's prices. And yet the FY 2026 budget is still pouring $6.5 billion into conventional munitions procurement through the existing model. There's a gap between the strategic diagnosis and the budgetary response.
That gap is real, and it's not unique to this domain. Defense acquisition reform is notoriously slow, but I'd argue the fact that the DLA is publicly making the case for supply chain agility and that OSTP is receiving white papers on AI-driven distributed manufacturing suggests the conversation is at least happening at the right levels. Whether it translates into procurement reform is a different question.
So the ideas are in the room. The question is whether the institutions can move fast enough to act on them.
And that's always the tension in defense policy. The threat environment moves faster than acquisition cycles. The Ukraine conflict accelerated munitions consumption in ways that exposed gaps the industrial base wasn't prepared for. The question is whether that exposure is enough to drive structural change, or whether the system reverts to its default settings once the immediate pressure eases.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. We've been talking about zip code level micromanufacturing as a concept, but the underlying argument is about what kind of defense industrial base the US wants to have in a world where supply chains are contested, foreign ownership is expanding, and high-intensity conflict is consuming resources faster than centralized systems can replenish them.
And the answer to that question has implications that go well beyond small arms. Small arms is a useful lens because the numbers are concrete. 212 establishments, one dominant plant, a key propellant ingredient sourced from China, but the structural logic applies across the defense industrial base. Semiconductors, energetics, rare earths. The concentration problem is everywhere.
So the zip code level vision is almost a proof of concept for a broader philosophy of distributed, resilient production.
That's a good way to put it. If you can demonstrate that AI-driven additive manufacturing can meet the precision and throughput standards for small arms components at a distributed scale, you've built the template for applying that model to other critical defense inputs. The small arms case is tractable enough to test and significant enough to matter.
And the stakes of getting it wrong are not abstract. The National Energetics Plan found that structural weaknesses could constrain the DoD's ability to meet rapidly rising demand for munitions. That's not a budget problem. That's a warfighting problem.
Exactly. And Fleet Admiral King's line, "You cannot be lethal without logistics," is as true now as it was in World War II. The DLA is quoting it in 2025 because the lesson keeps needing to be relearned. Logistics, and the manufacturing that feeds it, is not a background function. It is the foundation that everything else rests on.
So here's the thought I want to leave people with. The US has 212 small arms ammunition establishments for an entire nation. A key propellant ingredient comes predominantly from China. A $2 billion acquisition just moved iconic American ammunition brands under foreign control. And the DoD's own internal assessment says the domestic munitions industrial base is deteriorating. The case for distributed zip code level manufacturing isn't radical, It's a response to a set of vulnerabilities that are already documented, already acknowledged, and already being stress-tested by real-world conflict. The question isn't whether the system needs to change. The question is whether the institutions can move fast enough to change it before the next disruption makes the decision for them. Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. If the supplier is now part of the kill chain, then where that supplier is located and who controls it might be the most important defense question nobody's talking about.